In a quiet little neighborhood in Georgia, there lived an elderly woman who everyone called Miss Ruth. She was 72 years old and had spent most of her life teaching kids at the local school. Even after retiring, she remained active in her community, always, ready with advice or a kind word for anyone who needed it. Her house wasn't fancy, but it was cozy, filled with photographs of happier times, family heirlooms, and memories stitched into every corner. Miss Ruth's son worked far away, doing something important that he rarely talked about. He visited when he could, but his job kept him busy, often traveling to places she'd never heard of. Though they didn't see each other much, their bond was strong. Every week they spoke on the phone, sharing stories and checking in on one another. But lately, Miss Ruth had been feeling lonely. The neighborhood had changed over the years. Fewer families lived nearby now, and many of her friends had moved or passed on. Still, she tried to stay positive and keep herself occupied by tending to her garden and volunteering at the church. One sunny afternoon, as Miss Ruth watered her roses, she noticed two men walking toward her front gate. They wore bright orange vests and carried what looked like toolboxes. One of them waved politely before calling out, "Ma'am, we're here about the gas leak report." Miss Ruth paused, confused. Gas leak? She hadn't smelled anything unusual, nor had she reported any issues. Still, these days, utility workers came around all the time for routine checks. It wouldn't hurt to let them take a quick look, would it? She wiped her hands on her apron and walked over to the gate. "Gas leak?" she asked, tilting her head slightly. "I didn't call anyone." The taller of the two men smiled reassuringly. "Oh, don't worry, ma'am. We got a notification from headquarters. Just want to make sure everything's safe. These things can be tricky if not caught early." His tone was friendly enough, though Miss Ruth thought his accent sounded unfamiliar. Maybe he was new to the area. "Well," she said slowly, "come on in then. Let me show you where the meter is." As she led them inside, the second man stayed, close behind her, carrying a clipboard and pretending to jot down notes. Once inside, the taller man gestured toward the basement door. "Mind if we check down there too? That's usually where problems start." Miss Ruth hesitated for just a moment. Something nagged at the back of her mind, a faint unease, but she brushed it aside. After all, they were wearing uniforms and seemed professional. Plus, people didn't just break into houses dressed like utility workers. Did they? "Sure," she finally said, opening the basement door. "Be careful going down, the stairs are a bit steep." While one man headed downstairs, the other stayed upstairs, supposedly to inspect the main line near the kitchen. Miss Ruth hovered nearby, watching as he knelt beside the stove and pretended to examine pipes. Occasionally he'd ask her questions, things like how long she'd lived in the house or whether she'd noticed any strange noises recently. At first, she answered willingly, happy to chat, but as the minutes ticked by, she began to feel uneasy again. Downstairs, the second man worked quickly, rummaging through drawers and cabinets. He stuffed cash, jewelry, and small valuables into a duffel bag. Old coins, gold rings, even a locket, engraved with faded initials, all gone within minutes. Upstairs, his partner kept Miss Ruth distracted, making idle conversation while keeping an ear out for trouble. By the time the thieves finished their inspection, they were calm and collected. The taller man reappeared from the basement, wiping his hands on a rag. "All clear, ma'am," he announced cheerfully. "No leaks. Everything looks good." Relieved, Miss Ruth nodded. "Thank goodness. I was worried for a moment." They exchanged pleasantries before leaving, tipping their hats and thanking her for her time. As soon as they drove off, Miss Ruth closed the door and leaned against it, exhaling deeply. For some reason, she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. It wasn't until later that evening, when she went to retrieve a necklace from her bedroom drawer, that reality hit her like a punch to the gut. The drawer was empty. Panic rising, she rushed to check other spots, the cookie jar where she kept spare cash, the box of family photos under her bed. Everything was gone. Her heart sank as the truth dawned on her. Those men weren't utility workers at all. They were thieves, and she had let them waltz right into her home without a second thought. Shaking, Miss Ruth picked up the phone and dialed 911. When the operator answered, Her voice trembled as she explained what had happened. "I'm so stupid," she muttered, tears streaming down her face. "How could I fall for that?" On the other end of the line, her son listened silently as she recounted the story during their nightly call. His jaw tightened, anger simmering beneath the surface. He hated himself for not being there to protect her. But more than anything, he vowed to find the people responsible and make sure they paid for what they'd done. The days that followed the robbery were tough for Miss Ruth. She felt violated, as if her safe little world had been shattered overnight. Every creak of the floorboards made her jump. Shadows outside her windows seemed darker, more menacing. Even tasks she used to do without thinking, like watering her garden or opening the front door, now filled her with dread. The house, once a place of comfort and warmth, now felt like a reminder of how easily trust could be broken. Local police officers came by to take statements and gather evidence. They were kind enough, assuring her they'd do everything possible to catch the thieves. But deep down, Miss Ruth knew the odds weren't great. Cases like this often went cold, especially when the culprits were clever enough to cover their tracks. Still, she tried to stay hopeful. After all, she'd lived through harder times before, and always found a way to keep moving forward. Her son, who worked far away in a demanding job he rarely talked about, was furious when he heard what happened. He called her every night, his voice calm but firm as he asked for updates from the investigation. Each time, Miss Ruth assured him she was okay, even though she wasn't sure she believed it herself. "I'll be fine," she told him during one call. "It's just stuff. Things can be replaced." But her son didn't see it that way. To him, this wasn't just about stolen belongings. It was about someone targeting his mother because she was vulnerable. And that thought ate at him, gnawing away at his sense of duty and protection. He couldn't shake the image of her sitting alone in that house, left to pick up the pieces while he was miles away doing, well, whatever it was he did. After hanging up one evening, he sat in silence for a long time, staring at the wall. His mind raced with questions. Who were these men? How had they known exactly where to strike? Why his mother? Slowly, a plan began forming in his head. He couldn't rely solely on local law enforcement. Not for something this personal. If anyone was going to bring these criminals to justice, it would have to be him. The next morning, he requested emergency leave from work. It wasn't easy. His job required constant availability, and stepping away meant leaving behind responsibilities others depended on. But this was different. This was family. Within 48 hours, he was on, a plane heading home, determined to find answers. When he arrived, Miss Ruth greeted him at the door with tears in her eyes. She hadn't expected him to come, not so soon anyway, but seeing him standing there brought a wave of relief she hadn't realized she needed. For the first time since the robbery, she felt safe again. Over dinner that night, they talked about what had happened. Her son listened intently, asking detailed questions about the men, their appearance, mannerisms, accents, anything that might help identify them. Miss Ruth described the taller man's confident smile and the way he spoke, with authority, almost as if he truly believed he belonged there. The second man, she recalled, barely said a word but moved quickly, glancing around the room as if memorizing its layout. As they pieced together the events, her son grew increasingly certain of one thing. These weren't ordinary burglars. Their precision, their disguise, their ability to blend into the neighborhood unnoticed, all pointed to professionals, people who knew what they were doing. And that realization only fueled his determination further. The following day, he accompanied Miss Ruth to the police station to review security footage from nearby homes. Most cameras hadn't captured much, but one neighbor's camera showed two figures walking casually down the street in orange vests, carrying toolboxes. Though their faces were partially obscured by hats and sunglasses, the footage confirmed what he already suspected. They were pros. Back at home, her son spent hours poring over news articles and social media posts about similar break-ins across the region. Patterns started emerging. In several cases, elderly homeowners had been targeted under the guise of utility workers or repairmen. The modus operandi was strikingly familiar: friendly demeanor, convincing uniforms, and lightning-fast execution. Whoever these people were, they weren't amateurs. They were part of an organized operation. Determined to dig deeper, he reached out to old contacts from his line of work. These were people who understood how criminal networks operated, who could provide insights beyond what local authorities might uncover. One name kept coming up in conversations: a former soldier turned mercenary rumored to lead a crew specializing in high-stakes thefts. Details were scarce, but the description fit: a tactical mastermind with experience in covert operations. Miss Ruth watched quietly as her son transformed into someone she barely recognized. Gone was the easygoing young man who used to laugh over family dinners. In his place stood a focused, driven individual with a singular mission: to protect his mother and ensure no one else suffered the same fate. Despite her gratitude, she couldn't help but worry. What if something happened to him? What if chasing these criminals put him in danger too? Late one night, as they sat together on the porch watching fireflies flicker in the yard, she voiced her concerns. "You don't have to do this, you know," she said softly. "I'll be all right. I've gotten through worse." He turned to look at her, his expression softening. "I know you will," he replied. "But I need to do this, for you, for me, for everyone else they might target next. I can't sit back and let them get away with it." Miss Ruth sighed, knowing there was no changing his mind once he set it on something. Instead, she reached out and squeezed his hand. "Just promise me you'll be careful." "I promise," he said. Though both of them knew promises like that were easier said than kept. As the days passed, her son threw himself into the investigation, combing through leads and gathering information. Meanwhile, Miss Ruth tried to reclaim some semblance of normalcy. She tended to her garden, attended church services, and visited neighbors to check on their safety. Word spread quickly about the robbery, prompting many in the community to install extra locks or invest in security systems. Though grateful for the support, Miss Ruth couldn't help but feel guilty, as if she'd somehow invited trouble into their peaceful neighborhood. Still, amidst the fear and uncertainty, there was also hope. Hope that her son's efforts would pay off. Hope that justice would prevail. And hope that someday she'd be able to look back on this ordeal not as a moment of weakness, but as a testament to the strength of family and resilience in the face of adversity. The hunt was on, and her son wasted no time diving headfirst into the investigation. He wasn't just some guy looking for answers. He was a man with military-grade skills, sharp instincts, and an unshakable determination to protect his mother. But he knew that catching professional thieves wouldn't be easy. These weren't amateurs stumbling through half-baked plans. They were seasoned criminals who operated like clockwork. To take them down, he'd have to think like them. His first step was simple but crucial: blending in. If these men posed as utility workers, then he'd do the same. Within days, he acquired a set of orange safety vests, toolboxes, and fake ID badges, enough to pass for someone working in construction or maintenance. It wasn't hard for him to pull off the disguise. His broad shoulders and commanding presence gave off an air of authority, making people instinctively trust him without asking too many questions. Every morning he'd drive around neighborhoods, similar to his mother's, chatting up local contractors, electricians, and plumbers at coffee shops or supply stores. At first, he kept things casual, talking about weather delays or rising material costs. Slowly, though, he began steering conversations toward recent break-ins targeting elderly homeowners. Most folks had heard whispers about the crimes but didn't know much beyond rumors. Still, every little detail helped paint a clearer picture. One day, while grabbing lunch at a diner frequented by tradespeople, he struck gold. A grizzled old plumber sitting next to him leaned over and said, "You hear about those guys running scams dressed like us? Real shame what they're doing to folks." Her son nodded sympathetically. "Yeah, I've heard bits and pieces. Any idea who's behind it?" The plumber shrugged. "Not sure, but word is there's a crew led by this ex-military guy. Calls himself Cole. Heard he used to run ops overseas before going rogue. Now he uses his skills to rob people blind." That name, Cole, stuck in his mind like a splinter. Over the next few days, he dug deeper, piecing together fragments of information from various sources. Cole was apparently a master tactician, someone who could plan a job down to the smallest detail. His team moved quickly, striking only where they knew they could get in and out without raising suspicion. They studied their targets carefully, learning routines, habits, and vulnerabilities before making their move. Armed with this knowledge, her son decided to go undercover in earnest. Posing as a contractor looking to expand his business, he attended networking events and joined online forums where tradespeople swapped tips and leads. It didn't take long for him to catch wind of a potential lead, a meeting scheduled at a rundown warehouse on the outskirts of town. According to whispers, it was where stolen goods were fenced and divided among members of the gang. He knew getting close to the operation would be risky, but he also understood that playing it safe wouldn't get results, so he devised a plan. Using his connections, he arranged to meet with one of the lower-level members of the gang, a guy named Ray, who acted as a middleman between buyers and sellers. Ray was known for being greedy but not particularly bright, the kind of person who might slip up if pushed hard enough. Their meeting took place late one evening in a dimly lit bar on the edge of the city. Her son introduced himself as a buyer interested in acquiring special items discreetly. Ray eyed him suspiciously at first, clearly sizing him up, but when her son flashed a wad of cash and hinted at bigger deals down the line, Ray relaxed. "Noticeably, you got good timing," Ray said with a sly grin. "We've got fresh inventory coming in tomorrow night. High-quality stuff too, jewelry, antiques, you name it." Her son nodded, pretending to be impressed. "Sounds promising. Where's the drop-off happening?" Ray hesitated for a moment, then leaned closer. "Can't say much here, but I'll text you the address after we leave. Just make sure you bring the money, and keep your mouth shut." By the time they parted ways, her son felt a surge of adrenaline coursing through him. He had cracked open the door, and now it was time to push further inside. Back home, Miss Ruth watched as her son came and went at odd hours, always dressed in his worker's gear. She didn't ask too many questions, knowing better than to pry, but she couldn't ignore the tension radiating off him, the way his jaw tightened whenever he thought no one was looking. One evening, as they sat together in the living room, she finally broke the silence. "Are you sure this is worth it?" she asked gently. "What if something happens to you?" Her son looked at her, his expression softening. "Mom, I can't let them win. Not after what they did to you. Besides, I've been trained for situations like this, trust me. I know what I'm doing." Miss Ruth wanted to believe him, but worry gnawed at her nonetheless. She remembered stories he'd told, growing up, about missions gone wrong, about close calls that left even the toughest soldiers shaken. This wasn't just some job, it was personal, and that made it all the more dangerous. Still, she held her tongue. Deep down, she knew there was no stopping him once he set his mind to something. Instead, she focused on small ways to support him. Making sure he ate properly, keeping the house quiet so he could rest, and reminding him to stay safe whenever he left. As the days passed, her son grew closer to uncovering the truth. With each new lead, each snippet of information, the puzzle pieces started falling into place. He learned that Cole and his crew weren't just random thieves. They were part of a larger network, feeding stolen goods into underground markets across multiple states. Their operations were slick, efficient, and ruthlessly calculated. But, despite their professionalism, they weren't invincible. Every criminal left traces, however faint, and her son was determined to find them. Armed with patience, strategy, and sheer willpower, he prepared for the final phase of his mission, luring the gang into a trap where law enforcement could swoop in and shut them down for good. It was a risky plan, fraught with danger. But for her son, failure wasn't an option, not when it meant protecting his mother and ensuring justice for everyone else who'd fallen victim to Cole's schemes. As he sat alone in his car one night, staring at the address Ray had sent him, he allowed himself a brief moment of reflection. The road ahead would be tough, perhaps even deadly. But as long as he stood between Cole and innocent people like his mother, he knew exactly where he needed to be. The night of the sting operation was cold and moonless, perfect for staying hidden. Her son had spent days preparing for this moment, coordinating with trusted contacts and law enforcement to ensure everything went smoothly. He knew it was a delicate balance, getting close enough to gather evidence without tipping off the gang. One wrong move and the whole plan could unravel. He arrived at the warehouse early, parking his truck a safe distance away. The place looked abandoned, its windows boarded up and walls covered in graffiti. It was exactly the kind of spot criminals would choose for their dealings. Out of sight, out of mind. As he approached on foot, he could hear faint voices echoing from inside. They were already there, setting up for the exchange. Her son slipped into character seamlessly, adjusting his posture and demeanor to match the persona he'd created. A no-nonsense contractor looking to make some quick cash. His heart pounded as he pushed open the creaky metal door, stepping into the dimly lit space. Inside, the scene was chaotic but controlled. Boxes were stacked haphazardly against the walls, and makeshift tables held piles of stolen goods. Jewelry, electronics, antiques, all gleaming under flickering fluorescent lights. At the center of it all stood Cole, the man everyone whispered about. Tall and lean with sharp features and piercing eyes, he exuded an aura of authority that demanded respect, or fear. He glanced up briefly as her son entered, giving him a once-over before returning to his conversation with another member of the crew. Her son didn't need anyone to tell him who Cole was. The man's presence spoke volumes. "Hey," her son called out, keeping his tone casual. "Ray said you've got something worth seeing." Cole turned fully this time, studying him with a calculating gaze. "You're the buyer?" "That's right," her son replied, pulling out a thick envelope filled with fake cash. "Let's see what you've got." For a few tense moments, Cole just stared at him as if trying to read his thoughts. Then, with a curt nod, he gestured toward one of the tables. "Take your pick. But remember, the price doesn't change based on how much you like it." Her son forced a smile, pretending to browse through the items while secretly scanning the room. Undercover officers posing as buyers mingled nearby, blending in perfectly. SWAT teams were stationed outside, waiting for the signal to move in. Everything hinged on timing. If they acted too soon, the gang might scatter. Too late, and someone could get hurt. As the minutes ticked by, the atmosphere grew increasingly tense. Her son kept one ear tuned to the chatter around him, picking up fragments of conversations. Most of it was small talk, but occasionally key details slipped through: names, locations, future plans. Each tidbit brought them closer to dismantling the entire operation. Then, suddenly, Cole's demeanor shifted. He straightened up, his eyes narrowing slightly as he scanned the crowd. Something wasn't sitting right with him. Her son noticed the change immediately and braced himself, ready to adapt if things went south. "What's going on?" Cole asked sharply, addressing one of his men. "Why are there so many new faces tonight?" Before anyone could answer, the sound of tires screeching outside broke the silence. Panic rippled through the room as headlights illuminated the entrance. The decoy had worked. Undercover units were drawing attention to flush out the gang. In seconds, chaos erupted. Men shouted orders, scrambling to grab weapons or flee. Her son reacted instinctively, ducking behind a stack of crates as gunfire erupted. Adrenaline surged through him, sharpening his focus. This was the moment he'd been training for, the culmination of weeks of planning and preparation. He spotted Cole making a break for a side exit, moving with the precision of someone who'd done this before. Without hesitation, her son gave chase, weaving through the maze of crates and debris. His military training kicked in, guiding every step, every breath. Cole was fast, but her son was relentless. When they reached the edge of the warehouse, Cole spun around, a gun in his hand. "You picked the wrong fight," Cole snarled, raising the weapon. Her son froze for a split second, then lunged forward, using the element of surprise to disarm him. The two men crashed to the ground, grappling fiercely. Years of combat experience made the fight brutal but evenly matched. Punches landed, grunts echoed, and sweat dripped onto the dirt-streaked floor. Finally, her son managed to pin Cole down, pressing his knee into the man's chest. Breathing heavily, he leaned in close. "This isn't just about me," he growled. "It's about every single person you've hurt, every family you've torn apart." Cole glared at him, defiance burning in his eyes. "You think locking me up fixes anything? There'll always be more like me." "Maybe," her son shot back, "but not tonight." With that, he signaled to the officers closing in. Within moments, Cole was handcuffed and dragged to his feet, spitting curses as he was led away. The rest of the gang was rounded up quickly, their carefully orchestrated empire crumbling in a matter of hours. Back at the house later that night, Miss Ruth waited anxiously for news. When her son finally walked through the door, bruised but triumphant, she rushed to him, tears streaming down her face. "Are you okay?" she asked, clutching his arm. "I'm fine," he assured her, pulling her into a tight hug. "It's over, Mom. They're done." She nodded, relief washing over her like a tidal wave. For the first time in weeks, she felt like she could breathe again. Together, they sat at the kitchen table, sipping tea as he recounted the events of the night. Though parts of the story sent shivers down her spine, she couldn't help but feel proud of her son, for his courage, his determination, and his unwavering love. As dawn broke over the horizon, painting the sky in soft hues of pink and gold, Miss Ruth realized something important. Evil might strike unexpectedly, yes, but so could resilience. And sometimes, all it took was one person refusing to give up to turn the tide. The days following the takedown of Cole's gang felt like a mix of triumph and quiet reflection for Miss Ruth and her son. The neighborhood buzzed with news of the arrests, and local authorities praised the operation as a major victory against organized crime in the area. Reporters showed up at their door eager to get a story about the brave family who had faced such danger head-on. But both mother and son politely declined interviews, choosing instead to focus on healing and rebuilding. Miss Ruth spent most of her mornings sorting through the items that had been recovered. Some things were missing forever, irreplaceable, heirlooms, photographs, and trinkets tied to memories she'd never fully recover. Still, holding even a fraction of her stolen belongings brought her comfort. She sat at the kitchen table one afternoon, running her fingers over an old silver locket engraved with faded initials. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened it, revealing a tiny black and white photo of her late husband inside. It wasn't much, but it meant everything. Her son watched her from across the room, leaning against the doorway with his arms crossed. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. His presence alone was enough to remind her she wasn't alone anymore. Over the past few weeks, they'd grown closer than ever before, bound not just by blood but by shared pain and resilience. For him, this ordeal had been more than just a mission, it was a wake-up call, a reminder that no matter how far away life took him, his roots were here, with her. One evening, as they sat together on the porch watching the sunset, Miss Ruth turned to him with a thoughtful expression. "I've been thinking," she began, softly. "Maybe it's time I made some changes around here." He raised an eyebrow, curious. "What kind of changes?" "Well," she said, gesturing toward the garden. "For starters, I want better locks on the doors and maybe even a security camera or two. And—" She hesitated, glancing at him. "Maybe I should stop being so trusting all the time. Not everyone deserves it." Her son smiled faintly, though there was a hint of sadness in his eyes. "Mom, you're the kindest person I know. Don't let what happened change who you are. Just be smarter about it, okay? That's all I ask." She nodded, appreciating his honesty. "You're right. But I think it's also important to remember that bad things happen. Not because we deserve them, but because people make choices. Choices we can't control." "That's true," he agreed. "But we can control how we respond. And look at us now. We're stronger because of it." Their conversation drifted into lighter topics after that, laughter replacing the weight of recent events. They talked about plans for the future, small ones, like planting new flowers in the garden, and bigger ones, like him visiting more often. Despite the scars left behind, hope lingered in the air, carried by the promise of second chances. A few weeks later, the community came together to host a small gathering at the local church hall. Neighbors brought food, stories, and gratitude, creating an atmosphere of unity and support. Miss Ruth stood near the entrance, greeting everyone warmly, while her son hung back, observing quietly. He wasn't used to being the center of attention, but tonight, he accepted it graciously. People wanted to thank him, not just for catching the thieves, but for showing them that standing up to injustice mattered, even when it seemed impossible. As the evening wore on, a young woman approached Miss Ruth, clutching her child's hand tightly. "Thank you," she said earnestly. "After hearing what happened to you, my husband and I finally installed cameras outside our house. We feel safer already." Miss Ruth smiled, touched by the gesture. "That means so much to hear. Please take care of yourselves and each other." It was moments like these that reminded her why she loved living in this neighborhood. Even after something terrible, people found ways to come together, to learn and grow stronger. Her son noticed the exchange and walked over, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "See?" he murmured. "Good still outweighs the bad." Later that night, as they drove home under a starry sky, Miss Ruth glanced at him. "Do you ever wonder if things would have turned out differently if you hadn't come back?" He thought about it for a moment, then shook his head. "No, because I couldn't imagine letting you face this alone. Family sticks together, no matter what." His words stayed with her long after they returned home. As she climbed into bed that night, she realized something profound. The robbery had shaken her deeply, yes, but it had also reminded her of the power of love and determination. Without realizing it, she and her son had become symbols of strength for their community. Proof that even in the darkest times, light could shine through. Months passed, and life slowly returned to normal, or at least a new version of it. Miss Ruth grew more cautious, but refused to let fear dictate her actions. She continued volunteering at the church, tended to her garden, and welcomed neighbors with open arms. The extra security measures gave her peace of mind, allowing her to focus on what truly mattered: connection. Her son returned to work eventually, though he promised to visit more frequently. Before leaving, he helped reinforce the house's defenses, teaching her basic self-defense techniques and setting up a panic button linked directly to local authorities. "Just in case," he said with a wink, "though I doubt anyone will try messing with you again." On his last day in town, they stood side by side in the backyard, admiring the blooming roses. "You did good, Mom," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You handled everything with grace and courage." Tears welled up in her eyes, but she blinked them away, smiling. "So did you, my boy. So did you." As he drove off, Miss Ruth waved until his car disappeared from view. Then, turning back to her garden, she knelt down to pluck a stray weed. Life moved forward, carrying its joys and sorrows alike. But for Miss Ruth, one truth remained clear. No matter how hard the storms raged, resilience would always bloom anew, like the first flower of spring.